Hello everyone, today we talk about the official religion of the Roman army, setting as a timeline more or less the 1st and the 3rd century AD, but actually the topic, which is deeply overlooked by the way, should be extended a bit more historically in time, as there is all a development with a lot of continuity obviously from the origins of Rome, and certain practices and cults also developed along the way. So for today we stick roughly to the early empire, and we'll see it now. We'll read basically the Feriale Duranum, and eventually we'll comment a bit on the contents and add something else about what we know, at least about the official religious practices of the Roman army, because on another occasion we will actually discuss the private cults of the Roman legionnaires, which is another story. This is really about the public cults, right, the public religion that the Roman army obviously respected as a component of the Roman state, and that couldn't be anything different. These videos are obviously aimed at making, generally speaking, the larger audience realize that the Roman Empire was nothing like a sort of modern secularized entity as it's being depicted sometimes, but basically the exclusive, the single foundation of the empire was religious. Like, there was no other ground on which in the ancient world anything could be based practically. So the empire is a religion. War, accordingly, is as being the imperium, a faculty of course of the military commander, but more in general of the warrioring part, depending on how the interaction with the divinity was really like, was the same base of what we call like the Roman Empire, like the Roman state, right? We always have to be able to acknowledge this, that more than anything else within the Roman state, it was religion that founded and justified the entire construction, right? And so we'll see now how this develops. So to make long story short, the official cults of the Roman army were practiced in a uniform way throughout all the empire, and they were observed by all the army corps, from the legions to the auxiliary units to the fleet. And we talk about the Feriale Duranum because this is this interesting list of the various rites that were practiced during the year, and more specifically the year 225 AD. So we are in the Severian age. It's basically a calendar, right? You can't say that, of the religious festivities that were observed in the Roman army. And it's contained in the papyrus of the cohorts Vicesima Palmyrenorum. I will keep using the classical pronunciation as far as we know what it is. It would be Vicesima in ecclesiastical, but it means the 20th cohort of the Palmyrians. I don't know how to say that in English though. And that was stationed at Dura Europos, so in Mesopotamia, in the Far East, on the easternmost frontier of the empire. And that's an area where that a lot of stuff is being found. Also, papyrus preserves itself better with dry weather in there. So we're lucky, actually, very lucky to have this document. And in fact, part of the Feriale Duranum, which simply means in Latin would be the feriale, meaning the list of the festivities, right, of the ferie or feriae in classical pronunciation. Duranum means from Dura Europos, right? It's that simple. And in fact, we lack the information relative to the months of October, November, and December. Right. So now we read the Feriale Duranum, and then we'll comment. So, January the 3rd, on this day were sacrificed the animals in order to celebrate the power of the Roman Empire. An ox to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and a cow to Jupiter Victor, to Juno Regina, which means, obviously it means Jupiter winner, Juno Queen, to Juno Servatrix, which means the savior, the preserver, right? To the Dea Victoria, and to Minerva, right? So to victory in Latin. And a bull was sacrificed also on January the 3rd to Mars Pater, Mars Victor. So father and winner Mars, right? And we will see later on what all the meanings attached into Roman religion to this. So we're very late in time. Of course, many things have changed since the archaic Roman religion. A lot of different cults have been added, but still, this Feriale Duranum shows a fairly conservative religion, and the main intrusion, let's say, it's the one of the emperors, as we will see now, the family members of the emperor, etc. But at this point, as you know, the Roman Empire had strongly transitioned towards a more monarchical form. We're beginning of the 3rd century. So on January the 7th were sacrificed an ox to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, a cow to Juno, Minerva, and to the Dea Salus, so the goddess health. And a bull was sacrificed once again to Father Mars, to Mars Pater. On January the 8th was celebrated the birthday of the empress. Between January the 9th and the 23rd was celebrated the birthday of Lucius Caesar, Lucius Caesar, if we want to, for what we think classical pronunciation was. On January the 24th was celebrated the birthday of Adrianus, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. So notice in here these past figures. Hadrian had been deified, right, as an emperor, etc. So it's why these figures in their spirit was remembered in this sense as a protector. On January 28th was celebrated the victory over the Parthians, and a cow was sacrificed. It was also celebrated the anniversary of the ascent of Trajan, that was honored with an ox. On February the 4th there was a supplicatio, that we'll see later better what it is, dedicated to Antonius Magnus, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. On March the 1st was celebrated the birthday of Mars Pater Victor, and a bull was sacrificed in his honor. On March the 7th it was celebrated the anniversary of the ascent of Marcus Antoninus, that was honored with an ox, and the ox was sacrificed in honor of Lucius Verus. On March the 13th it was celebrated the appointment to emperor of Alexander Severus, and a bull was sacrificed to Mars. On March the 14th it was celebrated the appointment of Alexander as Pontifex Maximus, so the highest religious office in the Roman magistracies, and a bull was sacrificed to Augustus. On March the 19th there was the solemn prayer for the day of the Quinquatria, which was a festival sacred to the goddess Minerva. And the celebrations prosecuted up to March the 23rd. Then on April the 4th was celebrated the birthday of Antonius Magnus, and a ox was sacrificed in his honor. On April the 9th an ox was sacrificed in honor of Pius Severus. On April the 11th was celebrated the birthday of Pius Severus, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. On April the 21st was celebrated the anniversary of the foundation of Rome as the Eternal City, Roma Eterna, and a cow was sacrificed. On April the 26th it was celebrated the birthday of Marcus Antoninus, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. On May the 7th was celebrated the birthday of Julia Mesa, to whom was dedicated a supplicatio. On from between May the 9th and May the 11th was celebrated the festival of the Rosa. On May the 12th were held certain races in the circus in honor to Mars, and a bull was sacrificed in honor of Mars Pater Ultor, which means Mars Father, the Avenger, right? On May the 21st was celebrated the acclamation of Severus as emperor. On May the 24th was celebrated the birthday in the memory of the birthday and the memory of Germanicus. On May the 31st, supplicatio was dedicated to the festival of the insignia, of the military insignia. They were sacred, by the way. On June the 9th was celebrated certain festivals to the goddess Vesta with a supplicatio. On June the 26th was celebrated the anniversary of the appointment to Caesar of Alexander Severus, and a bull was sacrificed to his genius, that we'll see later but what it is better. And on July the 1st was held a supplicatio in order to remember the first appointment to consul of Alexander. Between July the 2nd and the 5th it was celebrated the birthday of Matidia, and to her was dedicated a supplicatio. On July the 10th was celebrated the anniversary of the ascent of Antoninus Pius, that was honored with an ox. On July the 12th it was celebrated the birthday of Julius, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. On July the 23rd were celebrated the Neptunalia. There were and that also entailed some supplicationes and sacrifices. On August the 1st were celebrated the birthdays of Claudius and of Pertinax, and to whom was sacrificed an ox, to the both of them. On August the 5th were held races in the circus in honor of Salus, and a cow was sacrificed in her name. Between August the 14th and the 29th was celebrated the birthday of Mamea, mother of Augustus, and a cow was sacrificed to Juno. Mamea or Mamaya, also depending on which pronunciation you choose. On August 15th to the 30th was celebrated the birthday of Marciana or Marciana. On August the 31st was celebrated the birthday of Commodus, and an ox was sacrificed in his name. On September the 18th were celebrated the birthdays of Trajan and of Nerva, and to both of them was sacrificed an ox. On September the 19th was celebrated the birthday of Antoninus, and an ox was sacrificed in his honor. From September the 20th to the 22nd was celebrated the birthday of Faustina, and to her was dedicated a supplicatio. And on September the 23rd was celebrated the birthday of Augustus, and an ox was sacrificed in his name. So, in this document we can notice how, besides the veneration of the traditional gods of the Roman pantheon, let's say, such as Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, Juno, Minerva, Mars, called as we've seen, Pater, Victor, Ultor, and other lesser deities, white space, in case of more than half of the festivals actually, was reserved to the figure of the reigning emperor, currently reigning emperor. In this case, Alexander Severus, as we've seen. Were celebrated in particular, besides his birthday, the Dies Natalis, the anniversaries of his first appointment to consulship and to Pontifex Maximus, and the appointment to Caesar, and naturally the appointment as emperor, the Dies Imperii, right? So the day of the empire. Then we have seen basically the birthdays of the wife of the mother, Julia Mamaea, or Mamea, if you prefer, and of the grandmother, Julia Maesa, or Maesa actually. And so were also celebrated significant anniversaries of different personalities that had been object of divinization, such as the birthdays or the rise to the throne of the emperors that had preceded Alexander Severus. So Caesar, Augustus, Claudius, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Commodus, Pertinax, etc. Or also other important members of the various Roman imperial families that had also been deified, such as Germanicus, Faustina, Marciana, with a particular attention to the families of the Severi and of the Antonini. And also other events were celebrated, such as the enlistment, the leave, the onesta missio. There were also other ways of being discharged, were not so it was not called honest leave. But it was also the infamous one, but today we don't talk about that either. However, it's interesting to look at these religious perspectives in their role, right? For example, a fundamental aspect of the Roman military religion consisted in the cult of the insignia, as we have seen. So that Tertullian, for example, writes in his Ad Nationes 1:12 that the Roman religion consisted merely into this, and he was pretty damn right? We talked about Tertullian, incidentally, a few time ago when we were talking about the literary production of the Severian age, and he was right. The Roman Empire was based exclusively, as we said at the beginning of the video, on religion, and more specifically on the military religion, right? This was basically what all the Indo-Aryan peoples had been about. The Romans believed fundamentally that their empire was a divine reward, right? It was such in the sense that in the Aryan perspective, what came from the sky was the only possible power that could make humans achieve a victory, right? And that was the same reason why during the Roman triumph, the victorious general was bringing literally victory and in its glory back to across the city, back to the temple of Jupiter. It was the main deity of the sky that had rendered that possible, right? This is very important, and the insignia, in this sense, represented deity as such, like all of this set actually of different, we will see also the geniuses, for example, but more in general, all of these forces that are one way or another derived from the celestial ones, right? So the fact that the insignia were sacred naturally was a necessity, and this was not just a Roman prerogative, but because of the sake of the esprit de corps and this idea of recognizing each other, being part of the same unit, and valuing that more than your own life, right? And that's how these peoples, albeit not really rationalizing the anthropological and religious connection between the two things, attributed so many honors to the insignia, because they were the sacred element as such. I mean, the Roman eagle that at this time has become the standard of each legion is the same symbol of the Aryan glory, right? It's the animal that represents the link between humans and the celestial deity of the sky. Is the only bird that can't look straight at the sun without getting blinded, right? And it is in fact always represented together with Jupiter in the Roman symbolism. And I also made a video about the Roman aquila, in fact, that is meant to represent exactly this, and is to be found in many other religions, not just the Indo-European ones, but also others. And it's this great symbol, this shared symbol that naturally has also to do with death, right? It's this connection that, however, well, here maybe we get rest a bit too much, but it's somehow the idea that the eagle, the predator, and it requires a tribute of blood, right, and of corpses, right, and that's what the deity asks for, right? It's hence the sacrifice that in part is in fact now normalized, because it's mostly animals that are sacrificed, but really in origin was the human sacrifice, conceptually speaking, that represented that, because it was the spoils of the enemy. And the Romans actually, throughout all their history, were never quite completely kind of rationalized in this sense. I mean, they were the Roman legionnaire, contrarily-wise to other formations of civilized peoples, was still very individualistic minded, still had a taste for the idea of the individual fighter. The Romans were fond of decapitations, for example, and there was a strong, we think today, well, that's brutality, right, pure crude, right, it's sadism, etc., but there was a very deep religious meaning into it. It was brutal. This is not, right, commending them, justifying what they were doing. It's simply, however, realizing that what we see today as gratuitous violence at the time was not, because the world society did revolve, right, just like the empire as such, around this concept that was shared basically by any other population at the time, that the winner the conqueror had the right to rule, right? So this the victory in general was the proof of the benevolence of the deity that naturally recognized a certain value to the men that had participated and gifted them with victory, right? But it was always something celestial, right? And so what eventually was given by the divinity was also reverted to the divinity at one point. And that had to do also with morals and what a righteous behavior was about. Because glory was sacred. It wasn't something that everybody could have. And in that video about the Roman eagle, I actually discussed this in acceptable detail, but we could also talk more about that on another occasion. All the rites and the public ceremonies, as well as the collective ones, such as, for example, the oath, like the sacramentum, as it was called, or the celebration of the leave, that was expressed with this phrase "sacramentum solvere," which means to solve your own oath, right? Happened at the presence of the insignia of the various units, right? And we're talking specifically, in fact, about the aquilae, or aquilae, if you prefer, the insignia, and the vexilla. And also at the presence of the imagines of the emperor, right? So these figures that represented, in fact, the imperial genius as such. So this, now we will explain it in a while, what this genius is really about. And a religious ceremony accompanied the consignment of the legionary eagle that was entrusted to the custody of the primus pilus, right? So the first spear, centurion first spear of the legion, so theoretically the bravest soldier of the legion. That was the one who in fact had the honor of had earned the privilege of maintaining of preserving the eagle, right? So the most sacred of the various insignia. And the anniversary of this episode was celebrated under the name of the Dies Natalis Aquilae, which means the birthday of the eagle, right? So it's as if this eagle had been born in the moment in which it was consigned to the legion, and it became, it basically founded the legion as such, or at the beginning at least, or however was restored. I mean, it came back as the most sacred representation of glory, of victory in the art. And it was also the insignia that opened the march of every military unit, from the maniple upwards. And yes, there were still maniples at this time. The maniple as administrative repartition of the legion did remain well after the Marian reform, right? So, and we also don't know excessively much about how the whole thing developed nominally, but let's say that like in other fields of Roman society, these religious symbols were practically everywhere. Like for every single activity, there was a deity that was invoked, basically, and protection was called upon. Whichever activity it had to be started, right? And that was meant naturally as a way to propitiate the deities in the enterprise, right? And in the military camps, the insignia were presided and constantly guarded in a sacred local that was known as the Ides or Edis. That was literally, like, sometimes it's translatable like the altar, but it's broader semantically speaking. It's literally a space. It's like a sanctuary. That's better definition maybe in modern words. It was often contained in turn, however, within the Principia, that were basically the headquarters of the legion, the building of command where generals were stationed, and the Ides in this sense was considered like a real temple, right? So a sacred area within the same military camp. And this is very, very interesting because, as you know, the camp was, at least the one of the march was, was changed in place every day during the march. But it was the insignia that sanctified this space and made it sacred. So another important aspect of Roman military religion concerned the Genii, which is the plural of the term genius. That there were a sort of guardian angels, right? You know, they were perceived like the individual instance of a general divine nature that is present in every individual person, place, or thing. This is very important because the figure of the genius is like this bridge between, we can't say animism and polytheism, that for the Romans, had come at a very short distance one from the other, meaning that the Roman civilization emerged from a state of primitiveness in extremely fast time. So the genius, as this entity, this is present also in other religions. It's like, for example, even in Judaism, you still find angels. Angels are nothing but this, basically. In that, the story is a bit more complicated, but at the base, in strictly religious terms, it's the same. It's all these entities, more than deities, that maybe in that case of Judaism actually were partially also deities, previous deities that these communities had given up for the monotheism, but still appearing there around the main god, right? In the Roman world, this was much more instead towards an animistic direction. Like every place had its own spirit, and that's in fact while many people believe, for example, that Roman religion was a sort of copy of the Greek one. As a matter of fact, it wasn't, because what we really call as Roman religion, first of all, is unknown, right? It's largely unknown. It was very archaic. the Romans basically didn't understand it themselves by not even by the 1st century BC at that point. They kept going on with the various deities, the various cults and rites attached, but they had lost understanding of much of it because society had drastically developed in a very few centuries, and this religion was very different from the Hellenic one. It was also much less. We think of a pantheon, for example, as if there was those standard gods that formed the only deities. This is a completely irrealistic and modernistic and actually monotheistic view of what polytheism was. Polytheism wasn't absolutely like that. Polytheism was a set of theoretically infinite entities that at one point are very difficult even to describe as deities or some other spiritual forces of sorts. In the case of the Romans, the genius was, as we said, just like a sort of guardian angel that would follow each man from the hour of his birth until the day he died. Right. For women in particular, it was also the spirit of Juno that would accompany each of them. But the term genius is very important because in its etymology, it stresses the original household guardian spirit. In the word genius, there is this Indo-European root, which is geni, which means to give birth, to produce. So the genius was originally, in Roman tribal society, the innate male power of a race or clan, right? This is typically Aryan, it's the base of what Rome was originally founded by in the Indo-European tradition. And hence other terms like gens, for example, that is the tribe, the people, it was this extended clans that still made the Roman aristocracy as such, the gens Julia for the Iuli, for example. And so it's as if a spirit was attached to that, and it's very interesting because sometimes they were even individual figure, right? In the case of the genius of the emperor, here we go a bit beyond, right? Because after the Battle of Actium, Octavian's power was so great that his success as a not just as we've seen as a simple winner, but as someone who had won victory through the divinity, was recognized also in parallel with kind of aura or spirit of essence of divinity into his deeds, right? Augustus propaganda stressed dramatically the connection that had existed between the civil wars and their end through Augustus' moral and religious refoundation of Rome. Because according to him, the explanation how the civil wars had happened for the chosen people of the Romans, that always remembered the Romans basically after the Jews were the people that truly believed to be chosen by God. I'm not kidding, but I know that these things are never told the way they should, but this is exactly how they thought it. And the civil wars could happen in this sense as a utter disruption of Roman society, and therefore by a great disaster that had been basically the profanation of the Sibylline books. So Augustus, according to him, had through the Auspicia followed divine instruction to restore the res publica populi Romani, right? And that's how the end of the civil wars had been interpreted, and hence also the new reordination that Augustus had given also politically and institutionally to the empire, that included, of course, the idea of the princeps, that in a strictly Aryan perspective couldn't be perceived but as just a first among equals, which is what princeps basically means. Like, it's not that Augustus in his time, ever thought to be like a king, even if de facto he was a monarch, right? But in the Senate, that point where the people was still strong and the senators and the aristocrats were still, power, he made this deal essentially with them. By the time of the Feriale Duranum, of course, you can see how the Principate has evolved into much more openly into a monarchy, and it will increase in that direction later on. So a lot of changes had occurred at that point. But the concept of divinity had been added through, in fact, the arms. I mean, Augustus had won, his armies had won by divine help. Like, always remember that when you look at these histories, it's not men that win. It's always the gods. This is not like the Middle Ages where God decided which battle. It was exactly the same in the ancient world as well. It was literally the same identical thing. It had always been like that, and it couldn't be like that in any place. The Romans were completely and totally about this. Like, their politics, their society functioned entirely and exclusively and essentially on a religious base. And that's how they could justify even the Principate had how it formed, because in recognition of the accomplishment that Octavian had achieved, later on he's deified as also, even as Augustus, means essentially like this greater state, like almost divine, basically. And Caesar had been deified as well. So in parallel to him, this deification didn't happen because of, this guy was different from the others. Like, of course he was different from the others, but it was the divinity that had created his figure. Hence, the genius is born. The genius of the emperor. So, the emperor is immortal, like anyone else, but his genius is something greater, is something bigger. It's like a deity to be formed. Now, this is interesting because you can find, even in other societies, like, take Gaelic Ireland, for example. The few deities that we know about, like deities, like kind of inconsistent, like, we can't even call them deities, because the concept was so shaded that you can't differ. Like, whether it was a spiritual force of a presence, we can't understand now, today, as modern people, as allegedly rationally oriented and kind of scientifically oriented individuals. We can't understand what for these people it was like. But in the case of Gaelic Ireland, it's like these local deities had divinities had emerged basically from ancient chieftains that had proven their deeds in life through war, had been buried. Over their tombs were formed kind of shrines. People went there to be inspired by them. Warriors would do, and later on, these men would become heroes, and then they would become gods, right? So this is, of course, in a completely different context, but still throughout the same logic, and a much more specified one, about which, unfortunately, through the sources we know very few, but we understand it was like this. A kind of spiritual entity could be formed that could be called upon, as we've seen in the Feriale Duranum, to guard, in that case, the army, right? And given that Augustus had been the one that had basically won the major disaster that, in historical and religious perspective, had ever happened to Rome in these later times, at the point that the same Roman people had turned against each other, which was inconceivable for the chosen people of God. It was completely impossible, right? Hence the Genius Augusti, right? Hence the Genius Augusti, and his the imperial cult as we've seen it in here. This is very, very important, right? Hence, what the Genius becomes, and this tradition is repeated, of course, for all the emperors that were deified after their death. Hence, all of these names that you can't read in the Feriality Random about these emperors. Not because these emperors, were kind of more fancy than others. Of course, there was a lot of political behind this as well, but it was still strictly religiously based. So it's interesting because the Geni, because Genius is the singular, Geni is the plural, protected a bit everything. Like there were as many Geni as many things, like as we have seen, individuals, families, groups, and in the case of the army, entire units. This is what the point was. It was like a set of many deities that made up the army, on the base of units, of course. For example, there was a Genius Centuriae, that is a genius of the century, a Genius Cohortis, which means a genius of the cohort, and a Genius Legionis, as well as a Genius Exercitus, actually. So, a genius of the legion, a genius of the whole Roman army as well, right? So you would understand at that point how important it was. And what I would like to make you understand here is that the esprit de corps, the sense of belonging, camaraderie, brotherhood, is still not very different today. Like today, of course, as we've said, we have a completely different take on these things. It's like irrational, but there is almost a sacred. Think about the sense of honor, right? What it means to be part of a unit, to shed tears and blood with other people, to whom you entrust your life. So it's very mystical. It goes beyond words. It's a feeling that objectively humans have as when they live in the way they do, like in this case as military, and that they come to identify still today with the insignia, in fact, with symbolism like medals, like uniforms, like with certain special symbolism attached to every unit that still differentiate itself. Well, it was like this since forever, right? And the Roman army, of course, in a completely religious world, naturally attached this religious identity, this religious persona, to each and every unit. There were furthermore Geni that protected also the categories and the various specializations of the army that with time tended to unite into kind of sort of corporative associations that were protected, where each one protected by their own numen, right? For example, there were the Geni of the Centuriones, so literally the genius of the centurion, of the Optiones, of the Signiferi, of the Vexillari, the Exploratores, the Mensores. So you see here, even like these were NCOs and other aides and operators that all had and it's still like if you take still modern Christianity, there are patterns of certain categories. Like the connection is very different at that point, because in Christianity paradoxically was much more secular than than the pagan world, conceptually speaking, because it's still separated. It still had the germs of separation of state and church, right? So even these patterns are meant as patterns, just symbolically speaking. I mean, not even in Christianity you actually believe that there is a connection between the two things. In these times, they believed that there was, right? So it was intrinsic. Of course, we can't be in the mind of a legionary of the 2nd century AD, but we have a general understanding, a general anthropological, religious, and historical, sociological understanding of that world, to know that, in a world where people believe in spirits and ghosts and monsters and something like that, such things were actually believed. I mean, there was nothing strange into it, and you can even say that today people are superstitious. Like, they believe in things that they know they're wrong, but they still kind of feel something about it, right? And the Romans, by the way, were probably the most radically superstitious people that was ever living like that. Like, okay, maybe they were at least amongst the most superstitious peoples at the time, and they cared a lot about this. The whole life, aside from the military, also in the civilian world, was regulated by such contracts, because it was essentially a contract, right? It was like, I respect you and you help me, right? This is the idea of paganism in a nutshell. Even certain places of the military camp had their own protector in a genus, right? For example, the praetorium, where they had the generals, were basically they lived. The tabularium, so the office, the valetudinarium, which was the first aid area, like where the military doctors operated, and the horreum, that is the granary. So you see, all these spaces they were actually pretty close in range, but that had each one their own deity attached. Like, you think in a granary, what do I need a deity for? Like, are you kidding me? Like, you need the granary to be always full, that, I don't know, rats do not eat everything, that food preserves itself, that other stuff can arrive from it. So all of this was perceived as related to the deity attached to the granary itself, right? And by offering sacrifices to it, it was believed that this would do, right, for making things go well. And the cult of the Geni also had the effect to reinforce the identity and the spirit of belonging to the army and its various units, right? This is really the most important thing. It's really becoming part of something different, right? It's like this still today. Like, the military does feel rightfully as something different from civilian society, because it undergoes different experiences. It shares different knowledge, different lifestyles, and beliefs, and different sense of belonging. It's not a surprise, for example, today we will not talk about that, but how, for example, Mithraism, there was a very violent cult developed from the east into the Roman army, especially during the 3rd century, but it was unknown in Rome since very early in time, actually, since the Republic, actually. And it stayed within the army, fundamentally. I mean, there were, of course, there was Mithraism also in civilian life, but at one point it came in competition even with Christianity, and Christianity won, essentially because Mithraism was a bit too exclusive, and it pertained just to the military. Well, also Christianity, however, was spreading. Incidentally, Mithraism is just another Indo-European. It's better the corruption of Indo-European Vedic understanding. Mithra would be one of the two, the Oscary of the Vedic pantheon, and it all comes straight from the Caucasian steppes, where all had been born in this sense. This is important. Another very important aspect of the military religion, keeping explaining, especially what we have read into the Feriale Duranum, is relatively the traditional religious ceremonies that could consist into a supplicatio or into an immolatio. So basically, what's the difference? So the supplicatio entailed a ceremony with wine and incense, while the immolatio consisted into the sacrifice of an animal. That could be either an ox or a bull or a cow. And an immolatio, a solemn immolatio, was constituted by the suo ve taurilia, that is, in fact, the sacrifice of either a pig, a sheep, or a bull. Particularly important aspect of the story here that to stress, and that we kind of hinted at before, is the relation of the Roman army with Jupiter and Mars, right? That we have encountered even into the Feriale Duranum as the major deities of war. And so here we are in the early empire. So as we said before, this is a moment in which Roman religion has kind of expanded, including, like every other paganism, many other cults from many areas of the empire and so on. But still, the ancient Roman religion was still alive, and we've seen it, in fact, into the official religion of the army. This stemmed from archaic Rome. It's lost in the mists of legend, because, as you know, Roman history, basically before the beginning of the 3rd century BC, I mean, it's not actual history. It's between legend and history, right? It's between myth and history, telling the truth. You can't rationalize that. You have to understand their own religion and studying it for what we know it, and you don't understand it's all symbolic. It's all a myth, right? But it's very meaningful myth. It also tells, of course, a lot of history behind the fogs of this religious aura. But in this fog, you can see definitely the martial origin of Rome. As we said before, and we can't stress this enough, Rome was a warlike society, right? Even at this point, in which it had become a great Hellenistic empire, substantially in culture, right? Still, the army, especially, and the relation with the imperial element, but especially in the army, remembered very strongly the original tradition, right? And I remember that the Roman army was the most successful and effective element of the whole Roman state, right, throughout all its history. And you can say here that everything revolved literally between Jupiter, Mars, and the Romans as a people proper. This was the ancient patrician triad, right? When in the mists of history, these Indo-European warriors came to inhabit these areas. The idea was like, I don't know, like in Vedic India, wherever the Indo-Europeans came, is that the conquerors were ruling as freemen and warriors over a mass of other people. That in Rome were nothing but the plebs, like the patricians initially were the only freemen. Hence where the Roman clans were, like all these Roman gentes, with their own genius, with their own spirit, like were from. The rest of the people had earned, as you know, in the struggles between patricians and plebeians, their own space in the army. Rome, especially by the early republic, is in fact a republic, in the sense that there is a citizen army at this point. It's not anymore about purely tribal culture. It has evolved into a city, which is very different, but still it's an hybrid in many ways. That's why Rome was nothing like, for example, the Hellenic polis, right? Not even in their military organization. Many people still believe that the Romans at a certain point adopted the Hellenic hoplitic phalanx. This is one of the most one of probably of the greatest mistakes, and one of the most widely unknown, like think that it wasn't absolutely like that. It never happened. The Italic warfare was radically different from the Hellenic one, and at the point that even when the Hellenic one was exported, telling the truth, elsewhere, it didn't quite work the way it did in the Greek motherland, because there were very different worlds. Very different worlds produced very different military systems. So it's very complicated, and I've promised for a long time at this point I would make a video on this topic, but it's like immense. I would have to make a series of videos more than else. But the patrician triad represented in this sense. The plebs had other deities, like Ceres, for example. I mean, they were mostly these female and / agricultural or like deities that had to do with non-warrior stuff, right? But there were also some intersections. For example, the plebs never saw Jupiter as a enemy god, for example. On the contrary, and because there was the broader recognition of the greater deity of the sky that is shared by many cultures, and therefore has to be, but also better understood in its relation. But for what we are concerned, the ancient patrician triad is Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. So as we have said, Jupiter represents the celestial deity of the sky. He is properly not a warrior god, but the god of war. And more than the god of war as such, right? It's not that there is a god of war, because we think, but wasn't it Mars that is the god of war? Not quite. It's not exactly like that. It's like in the Hellenic pantheon, for example, that also is slightly different. You even have Athena in there. That's the goddess of war, and she's actually more powerful than Ares, right? But what happened is that, unlike, for example, in the Germanic religion or in the Vedic religion, where the god of war is basically only one, like Odin or the Indra, right? They also have the lightning, etc. The Greeks and the Romans separately, and I think because they were at this point more advanced society that could specialize more their society, and therefore starting dividing and defining better these deities that multiplied, in fact, and that's what also properly polytheism is, not like animism is, had separated the god of war and the warrior god. That is to say that Jupiter is the god of war because it's from him that victory comes, and from no one else, right? He is the ruler of the universe in this sense. He's the god of the sky. He's above everyone else, and victory comes only through him. What Mars is? Mars is the warrior god. And you'll say, what's the difference? Well, the difference is great, because Mars properly has nothing to do with victory in itself. He is also called Victor because he is the one who wins as a fighter, but victory doesn't quite belong to him as such. It doesn't. Mars, just like Ares in the Hellenic pantheon, represents the animal fury. It could even be an animal as far as we are concerned. It's about mere fight, right? It's not about winning. In fact, basically Mars in Roman religion has nothing to do, for example, with the indictio belli, right? The war is open always by tributing honor to Jupiter, and all the thing is referred to him. Like the Mars has nothing to do with that. Mars has to do only with fighting, and when war and fighting has already began, by listening to other gods, by respecting the will of other gods. Mars is literally unchained in the arms and in the weapons of the fighters. Saevit. This is the verb that the Latins use in this to define it. It's unleashed. It's also known as Mars Caicus or Chekos, if you prefer, or Mars Insanus, which means literally blind with fury, telling the truth. This is the fury that the Romans described, for example, when they looked at the Germans and they saw this ancient Indo-European possession that seemingly derived from this shamanic trance It had to do also with the galloping of horses, with this drums that were used in the steppes. Still, the Germans had lost a great part of the equestrian tradition, but still they had very strongly this idea that they were drunk with this feeling that Odin gave, right? The Romans, as we've seen, had these two elements, right? It happened actually very late in time. Like still in the beginning of the 3rd century BC, actually there was the sense of the fury very strong. In the Battle of Sentinum, for example, there is the figure of Lupus Martius, right? That is this wolf that is this martial wolf, right? That it's all the story that this animal, like in the story of Livy, that literally, well, now we can't repeat everything, but there is this wolf that runs in front of the Roman ranks before the battle, and everybody, this is recognized. The Romans also opened their lines to let it pass. This is great omen of victory. But the truth seemingly is something we can't see anthropologically, in the sense that this was not a wolf. This was literally a human being, still dressed in wolf skins and all this stuff. And this thing was present in Italic warfare still at that point. At the point we have kind of erased, because we have decided to invent this picture of the Romans like the perfectly orderly legion where everybody doesn't blink an eye. No, these were warriors. These were tribal warriors still at the time. And they struggled like hell to confer discipline to those guys, to make the legions as we know them. And they also never completely lost that character at some point. So this idea of the champion that goes out there dressed in wolfskin in front of the enemy of the rest of the formation and throws itself against the enemy in this blind fury. This was perceived to be Martius, because after all, Romulus descended from Mars himself, and he had been nurtured by a she-wolf, as we know. And that's where Quirinus comes into place, because Quirinus is nothing but the Roman triad, the figure that symbolizes the Romans, right? The Roman citizens, because it comes from coviri, which means like men, like meaning warriors actually, together, right? The virtus that we think like an idealized Stoic thing, because we mostly know it from the time the Romans had kind of Hellenized and almost atheistic fashion, like with the this great kind of normal, I don't even know how to say that, abstract models, was in fact the same fury. I made a video about this that is titled The Indo-European Sacred Fury. It has to do with that, and it's literally the vir is the man that is able to be possessed by divinity. And in fact, in Roman religion, the traditional patrician gods were Jupiter's Mars, and rather than Quirinus proper and the Quirites as the Romans, the so-called simulacra infantium conditorum urbis sub uberibus lupae, which means basically the simulacra, which is an extremely difficult concept to explain. It's basically something between an image, a picture, but it's really the essence, the ghost, the idea that the feeling. This has to do with the deity, right? So it's as if they were the sanctuaries in some dimension, right, of the children founders of the city, and this is extremely important, sub uberibus lupae, which means, I would say hubris in Greek, but it's like the possession, right, of the wolf. So it's like the berserker fundament. It's the same exact thing. This was all Indo-European words. They function all in the same way. So basically, this was what the thing was. Jupiter and Mars were associated together with Quirinus in this sense, because it was more Mars that was close to the she-wolf and to the wolf and to this animal fury than Jupiter. Now, this is very interesting because it's as if the Romans, and also the Greeks in part, had separated, in fact, these two elements, because they had kind of rationalized politics and war alike. This is particularly evident in the Hellenic world, where you have Athena and Ares, and immediately the Greeks had understood that Athena is superior to Ares, right? Because Athena is the goddess of war, but she's the goddess of politics and intelligence and rationality, right? Ares is just a brute warrior, nothing else. It's like what barbarians are, right? Literally. Hence, Athena always won against Ares in Hellenic mythology. The Romans were very different in this because they still had kind of a much more primitive mindset. So this distinction came with much more ambiguity in some ways. Yet it still happened. And basically the Romans managed to identify, in my opinion, more in Mars, this virility, this ferocity that was unleashed, right, in the fight, right? Hence this idea of Mars, Pater, that we have read, because he was the father of the Romans. I mean, he literally was Romulus' father, hence the father of all of the Romans, as such. And the wolf was as well. So the animal fury was with them, which was in turn, however, a sacred fury, because as you know, like also in Germanic, in other cultures, like the wolf eats corpses. Like it's the animal that goes eating the people after battles on the field. It's a necrophagous animal. So it's just like in Germanic religion, it's connected with the dead, like the world of the dead and the world of the living, hence the world in this case of the warriors, because at this point in the European idea that it's all the men are warriors, right? So there is no distinction, hence that's why Jupiter is so important, because it's not just the god of war, it's the god of the whole life, of the whole society, of the whole politics, as those tribesmen conceived it, right? This is extremely important, and yet you find this distinction. In fact, for example, Mars and Ares do not have lightning, like Odin and Indra do, respectively in Germanic and Vedic religion. It's different. It's probably this form of rationalization that it was starting very slowly, especially in the Western Mediterranean, like mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean, but very slowly, especially in the West, it was taking place because these were evidently more advanced societies that could kind of starting rationalizing the separation. So, and I would stress also the importance of the dies imperii, that is the day in which the Roman emperors obtained from the Senate and the troops, which reminds the ancient, election of the chieftains by the warriors, the proconsular potesty, hence the imperium, that founded the Principate, that at this point is the institutional Roman Empire, right? So if you don't understand this base, fundamentally you can't understand Roman history and Western civilization. It all comes straight from there. And I don't know why this stuff is widely known in the world Indo-Europeistics. Like everybody knows, this is like the ABC. Frankly, I never met anyone who ever kind of knew this thing. I mean, of course, if I search on the internet, there is someone who knows that, obviously. But like in real life, no person has ever been taught this in a school. Like, and why? Like, why do we need to feel like the Roman Empire had to be somewhat like a 19th century Victorian Empire, when it was actually this thing instead? This was just for saying how important the same military institution was in the empire in the first place. When we talk about the Roman army, we're not talking about a simple component of Roman society. We're talking about the same justification of Roman power. Because as long as Romanist legion ruled the world, that was the proof that their deity was with them, and that their power was earned, deserved, because of their accomplishments, and that's why the eagle and the insignia. When Flavius Josephus writing about the Roman army, he talks about the Roman eagle and says that they, like, the Romans, in fact, considered it as a nomen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. Because that's the insignia of Jupiter. So it's literally the greatest power that can ever exist. And what is interesting is that we associate, in fact, like the eagle just to the Roman standard, like the Roman aquila, right? But actually the eagle was present in so many other Indo-European populations, including the ones the Romans were fighting. Like the Celts and the Germans definitely had stuff like that. They had winged helmets, stuff like that. We can recognize such symbolisms. Aside, of course, from the others that existed, but there was a hierarchy of these symbols. They're not just random. So now this is, I don't know whether I confused your ideas or not, but we will come back on this hopefully soon, because it's an incredibly fascinating topic, and it tells so much about Roman military culture that like practically no other thing does. And this is so overlooked that it's almost a shame, in my opinion, because this is literally, like, if you want to understand the Romans, this is literally what they believed in, and nobody tells you. So what the hell? Let's try to spread this awareness, because, by the way, it's extremely beautiful. Look at all the Roman art. I mean, this stuff I've posted also in pictures shows you that we've seen the various geni, the various the various symbolisms, the insignia, the spoils of war. This was what on the base on which the empire was built, by definition, right, institutionally speaking. Okay, so I think for today we stop, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.